Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, I'm looking at Operation Tonga, the British airborne element that led the way during the D-Day landings in 1944. I'm joined by Stephen Wright. Stephen is keenly interested in the operation, an operation his uncle was killed taking part in. And for the last 20 plus years, he's been researching the airborne and particularly the use of gliders during the closing years of the war. His book, co-authored with Kevin Shannon, Operation Tonga, brings the reader first-hand accounts of that night. Stephen is also involved with a new feature film, but we'll come to that later. But just before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank all those people who have taken the time to visit patreon.com/WW2 podcast and flicked a shilling into the virtual Brody helmet. The patronage of these loyal listeners helps me find the time to put the show together and hopefully make it better for everyone. That philanthropy is greatly appreciated. If you would like to become a patron of the World War II podcast, go to patreon.com/WW2 podcast or visit ww2podcast.com and click on donate. So Stephen, let's get started. If we start by looking at the glider my spell checker on my computer keeps wanting to change Gliderborne Force into Glineborne, which endlessly amused me. It was adamant that it didn't like the word Gliderborne. Shall we start by looking at the British Glider Force? How big a force was it at this point for this, for the first day of D-Day? I guess it is, isn't it? Operation Tonga.
In total, we've got 2 airborne divisions, the 1st and the 6th, and each of those divisions has got 2 parachute brigades and an air landing brigade. The parachute brigades are obviously concerned with the paratroops, whereas the air landing brigade, that's to do with the gliders. So you've got these 2 divisions with their respective brigades, and then you've got the glider pilot regiment. Now the glider pilot regiment is an independent regiment which services both divisions, and if you like, a third point of the triangle is RAF Transport Command. So you've got RAF Transport Command with 38 and 46 groups whose aircraft drop the paratroopers and tow the gliders. The whole is coordinated by a combined RAF Army Cooperation Command. So it's a huge operational entity, for want of a better word.
How much training had they all sort of done together pre D-Day?
They have been involved in several full training exercises. Now, by that I mean, and by the way, for D-Day we are only talking about 6th Airborne Division. So the parachute brigades are the 3rd and the 5th, and it's the 6th Air Landing Brigade. All those men, paratroopers and gliderborne, and if we're talking about the brigades, let's talk about the men in the Air Landing Brigade. So we have got the men of the 2nd Battalion, the Auction Bucks, the men of 1st Battalion, the Royal Ulster Rifles, and then the men of 12th Battalion, the Devonshire Regiment. So they, along with their paratroop colleagues, have been involved in full divisional exercises. So that means paratroop drops and glider tow stroke landings and night exercises and some daylight exercises. So the whole division has been involved in that for several months. I suppose ultimately the final training for D-Day kicked in towards the end of March, beginning of April. And the division was then involved in several, as I said, several division-wide training exercises. So, with the lifts and the drops going on. And each man knew his own role. As they got into it, they would know what their own role was, but they would also know the roles of the guys around them as well. Eventuality was that if it didn't go as it was supposed to, then all the tasks could be done because you knew more than your own job. But obviously, just in the training, that wasn't necessarily something that was pushed at that point. What was pushed was that they were to be, as ready as they could be for the invasion when it came, whether they be paratrooper or glider-borne infantry.
I think you state in the book that 132 of the glider pilot regiment died in training. I mean, that might have been for the whole of the war, or was that just... Either way, that's a lot of fatalities in training for what's a relatively small regiment.
The biggest loss to the regiment was in September with Operation Market. That was where the regiment took its biggest hit. There were fatalities, in training, and certainly the regiment lost members before they even got their third stripe. They were killed in either EFTS or glider training school.
The unit that was going to attack the battery, they were confined. So all the D-Day troops were confined to barracks for a certain period before they went, usually at the last minute. But these guys were confined for 2 weeks while they practiced on a replica battery, which again shows a level of determination. Where
you had these division-wide training exercises, there was also specific training, and that was certainly for the 2 coup de main tasks. The one, as you said, was the Merville Battery, where the intention was for Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway's 9th Battalion to capture that. The gliders were involved in that 3 gliders were to do a coup de main inside the battery defences. So there was not so much that there was the separate glider training for the guys to get up their skills for that landing, because don't forget, this was going to be taking place in the dark. Sicily, the previous year, had been a nighttime landing, but it was not on the same scale as this was going to be. That obviously raised risk, with this operation. So you've got the training for the Merville Battery, and then you've got the specific training for the capture of what would become Pegasus Bridge and Horsey Bridge. So that was D/B Company of the Oxen Bucks under Major John Howard taking those 2 bridges. And what everybody has come to know as Pegasus Bridge. And when you talk about gliders and when you talk about Normandy, most people that know anything will say straight away, "Oh, you mean Pegasus Bridge then?"
It was certainly a location I was taken to as a child when we went over with my father when he revisited the Normandy sites, and we had a big cup of coffee at the Pegasus Bridge and lots of photographs.
And that's the thing, as I said before, we're into this with the sort of 13th and 13th Parachute Battalion and Normandy, and synonymous names. People will equate gliders and Normandy with Pegasus. If you like, they are the sacred 3. There was a lot more to it. We're talking in total for this one operation alone, 363 transport aircraft. That included 98 gliders, and within those 98 gliders were the 6 that were on the bridges and the 3 that were on the battery. So it was a pretty big operation, and obviously the rest of those transport aircraft were the parachute aircraft.
What did the gliders carry?
After those 9 that were carrying men, the greater part of the glider element of Tonga was for the other tasks of Tonga. The overall or objective or aim of Tonga was to form a defensive screen between the Germans, in this case 21st Panzer Division, and the guys coming in on the beaches. So the taking of the battery, well, that was because the guns that were assumed to be there were capable of hitting the beaches, certainly Sword Beach, which the British were coming into around Westerham, where the ferry port is now. And the bridges, they were the Germans' way across the river and the canal to the beaches. So they had to be captured. But then there were other bridges over the Dives River that had to be destroyed as well, because they were also crossings that the Germans could use to get to the beaches. And then there was the rest of stopping the troops. So the gliders, the major part of which started landing around 3:30 on the morning of the 6th of June D-Day, they were bringing in anti-tank guns. And there was going to be then this ring of steel set up south of Ronville to hold off the Germans. So you've got a combined glider and paratroop operation. You've got the battery in the northeast there, towards the coast. You've got the bridges, which are a few miles inland. They are taken by gliders. Then in the fields north of Ronville, you've got the largest landing zone, drop zone, which is codenamed N, November. And into that, you've got the paratroopers coming in, and the 7th from the 5th Parachute Brigade are going to support John Howard and his men at the bridges, and indeed to work within the village of Benouville, and to be the defensive force there. You've got the 12th Parachute Battalion that is going to go around Ronville and establish itself on the ridge south of Ronville, at Le Bas de Ronville, on what's called the contour there. They're going to establish there. And the 13th Parachute Battalion is going to take the village of Ronville and then sort of establish defences and get itself sorted in that defensive line south of the village afterwards. And into that defensive line as well, you're also going to be getting these anti-tank guns.
Yeah, so essentially they're acting as transports, aren't they? Bringing in, I guess...
They are, absolutely. Yeah, they're acting as transports, bringing in the guns, bringing in the teams, the crews with those guns. They're bringing in engineer support. They're bringing in jeeps and trailers that the engineers, Tim Rosevere's engineers, will need to go and blow the bridges, over the Dives.
Stuff that we couldn't really parachute in.
A certain amount of stuff could be parachuted in, but the major role certainly for the gliders on Tonga was as equipment and materiel transport gliders.
How much intelligence had they had on the drop zones, the areas that were likely to come in, or drop or landing zones, a sort of interchangeable phrase? But were the Germans expecting an Allied airborne assault on these targets? Oh
yeah, absolutely. And the Allied command knew that from French resistance. They also knew it from the reconnaissance flights that specially equipped fighter aircraft took. So they did photo reconnaissance. Now, what the Allies did with this, they'd been gathering intelligence for months and months. One of the interesting ones is that they asked for people to send in postcards from that part of Normandy, and they gathered that as a big photo collection, if you like, and looked at that, particularly for the beaches and, and the buildings, the seafront, the buildings behind. So there was that part. But then you've got the aircraft that are flying in as well. And they're bringing the pictures back. And what the boffins in the back room are doing is building models, scale models. And these models are updated daily. They are absolutely amazing. And these were the models that would be used for the briefings, when the guys were in SEAL camp, as you said. a couple of 3 days before they're away. They were accurate to the very smallest, tiniest, minute detail. And one of the things that they found on the flights in May was that there were these white dots with shadows appearing on the photographs. And when the folks in RAF photographic interpretation looked at these, they worked out, and I think they also did get some intelligence coming in from the French resistance as well, but they found out that the Germans were actually planting anti-glider poles in these fields. So in the fields north of Ronville, where the greater part of the paratroops and the gliders were going to land on Operation Tonga, there was this vast forest, if you like, of anti-glider poles, some of which had been wired together and had explosives attached. This was a wholly new phenomenon, if you like, for Allied command. They not seen this kind of thing before.
It's a relatively straightforward thing to do, isn't it? It's not exactly expensive.
It isn't. I
mean, I guess they're just like sawn off telegraph poles planted in a grid.
Yeah, sawn off telegraph poles. Absolutely. And when you've got the free labour, as you have with all the in inverted commas conscripted, labour that you've got, you can just put these guys to digging holes and planting poles, and then of course you need your military, bit of training there to wire them up or whatever, but especially with the explosives. But there we go. So you've got that for the gliders, and then the Germans also flooded quite a large area of land as well, because again they knew that it was very likely that it wasn't if, it was when they come back to France. This is an ideal area. This is where we would put our airborne troops. So this is where the Allies are most likely to put theirs as well.
Did they just move their landing zones to be able to avoid the poles as best as they were aware of them?
No, what they actually did was they changed their plans of how they were going to deal with them. And so a company of the 13th Parachute Battalion, they landed and they stayed on the zone. And with them was 591st or 591 Parachute Engineer Company, Royal Engineers. And it was the engineers' task, helped, protected by a company of the 13th, to clear 2 landing strips ready for the main landing to come in at 3:30 in the morning. What they found was that a good number of the poles were kickable. So you put a good size 12 army boot against and you knock it out,
Push them over.
Yeah, push them over. There were some that the engineers had to deal with, but with the explosives. What they had designed as well, assuming that these poles were going to be well inserted, they would have to blow them out. So what they did was they took an ordinary inner tube, bicycle inner tube, filled it with explosive, put a wire on it, and made it a ring, as it was a ring. And then the idea was you drop that over the pole, and you set it off, and it cuts the pole in half, and that's it. The pole's gone. They may have used those once or twice. That they didn't really need to use them at all. What they did find useful though, and did use, was a bulldozer. There were 3 bulldozers which were sent on Tonga, and obviously they came in by glider. So it was the Horsa glider that brought them in, and these were American bulldozers built by a company called Clark, and they were called the Air Crawler, and they just fit without any kind of modification. They just fit inside a Horsa glider. So there were 3 tasked for Tonga. One was lost along with several of the men on board when the glider it was in came down off the coast in the channel. The other 2 got there, but only one was able to be used. The other one got stuck in the glide, so they were able to to get that moving. And the reason for that was also to help in clearing poles and really clearing debris and whatever, and before these gliders came in, because of course you've had all these guys have come in under silk, so you got all the parachutes there and whatever, so thing you want is gliders coming in and getting caught up in static lines and stuff.
If we sort of look at I guess they take off on the night of the 5th. They start to come over, and they're coming over in waves, so they're sort of coming over for hours. How were the landing grounds marked? How are they expected to find their targets over occupied France?
That was the job of the 22nd Independent Parachute Company Pathfinders, and they were a unit within 6 Airborne. They took off in 4 sticks from RAF Harwell about the same time as the gliders went off from Tarrant Rushton to the bridges. The Pathfinder's job was so that would have been before 11 o'clock. Their job was to mark the zones. They carried various devices. There was quite a rudimentary but not insignificant beacon location system. It was called Rebecca Eureka. Eureka was the ground-based unit, and Rebecca was on the aircraft. And it was it was a beacon locator. So Eureka sent out a signal, and Rebecca was set to locate that signal. And once the two locked on, the pilot knew that he was going in the right direction. They also had lights called holophane lights, which they could set up in a T formation. The idea was that the tail of the T was downwind, so that the aircraft would land into the wind coming along the T, and they would see those lights from above. And there are also a light set up to flash the Morse code letter for the particular zone that they were coming into. However, at final briefing for the operation, the Pathfinders the Pathfinder crews, they were given the wind over Normandy, and off they went. What happened was that the wind veered enough to throw everything out. So where the Pathfinders did make it and were able to set up their lights, they were set up as briefed, but they were in the wrong direction. So we've then got the stories of the glider pilots coming in and finding the lights and flying along the tail of the T, but they're actually flying downwind. So they got the wind behind them. So they're actually coming in much faster than they should. That was where the lights were set up, and also where Eureka was set up as well. The parachute landings for both brigades were scattered to the four winds, and there are countless stories of men landing miles away from where they should have. And I mentioned before about the flooded ground. Lots of men landing in that flooded land and just drowning, under the weight of the equipment. Because again, thing about these guys going in that a lot of people won't realise is that although they were fit young men and they were strong young men, they weren't big young men. You have to remember that this was 1940, and these guys were average age 19?
Right, 44, yeah, it'd be something like that, wouldn't they?
Yeah, 19, 20, We had 20 years before, we'd had the Depression, we'd had those really hard times. People they weren't big, necessarily the biggest, strongest, although they were used to a different kind of work than we are now, a lot of manual labour, and working on the field, working in factories and such like. They weren't necessarily big, and yet they were expected and did carry their body weight into battle.
Yeah, it's a terrific amount of kit they're expected to hold.
So it is no wonder that these guys that landed in not necessarily very deep water couldn't get out of it because they were just weighed down. So you've got them there, and then you've got other men that have landed amongst men that aren't in their, well, not even in their company. They're not even in their battalion. So you've got them all mixed up, on the drop zone as well. Lieutenant Jack Watson of A Company of the 13th Battalion, who I think it's a wonderful phrase, this. He described the initial scenes as a bugger's muddle. I think that's a wonderful description. This was in the dark. Men were landing all over the place. They were landing on top of one another. One thing that they found when they got there that they didn't know was there was standing corn. They had no idea they were going to be landing in wheat fields or cornfields. And then they've got to get out the parachutes, and they've got to find their way.
The funny thing about it all is, before we get into the whole muddle of it all, am I right in saying it's Dead Stick? That's the Pegasus bridge? Was that the first operation of the night to go in? What amazes me is how much of a fantastic success is compared to everything else immediately after it. So why was that so bang on?
Right. Well, I'll explain that. But first of all, and I'm prepared to be shot down on this one. But that operation, as far as I am aware, in all the years that I've been looking at this, was never, ever called Dead Stick. And I'm just going to put this now on record. If you read any of the documents, they talk about coup de main or they talk about the bridge party or parties. Dead Stick, and this comes to why it was so good, Dead Stick was the code name given to the training of the crews for the coup de main by Flight Lieutenant Tommy Grant. Tommy Grant was a very experienced tug pilot. He'd been involved in Sicily previous year, and he was appointed as chief trainer, if you like, or man in charge of, or officer in charge of training for the bridges operation, or bridges task rather, by George Chatterton, Colonel George Chatterton, who was the commanding officer of the glider pilot regiment. It was Colonel George who said to Tom, look, I know of your experience and I would like you to be in charge of this. So Grant put together the most amazing training program. And the reason why they were planned to be so successful was because of Grant's training program. He had the men training different stages. First of all, they were increasing their skills for daylight flying, and then gradually their sight got darker and darker, and then they were flying at night, and they were flying and landing at night without any ground navigational aids, because that was what they were going to be doing. It wasn't without, I was going to say disaster, we'll say problem. They did on one occasion manage to land one glider on top of another, but they did this time and time again until they were landing their gliders in an area not much bigger than a couple of football pitches. So it was Tommy Grant's training program. So you're absolutely right. They were the first men in. What happened? Well, on the canal bridge, Pegasus Bridge, the three gliders got into the field. Number one got there first, and number three overtook number two and got there second. But the three gliders got in. A couple of 100 yards down the road at the river bridge, one glider got to the bridge, another glider landed 2 fields away, and the third one landed at a completely different bridge several miles away. Now, that wasn't their fault. That was because they could only go where the tug aircraft took them. So by some navigational whatever, they ended up at a Talleyrand Bridge, which they captured, and then they made their way, fought their way back to where they should have been. But the plan was to capture the two bridges, and to hold them. There's that famous line, isn't there? From The Longest Day, hold until relieved, and that's what they did. They held those bridges. The river bridge was not occupied. The weapons pits and the trenches there were still warm, but there were no troops there. But they nevertheless got a defensive force there. But it wasn't long before they were called along the road to the other guys at Pegasus. When the paratroops came in, as I said earlier, 7th Parachute Battalion were tasked to go to the river bridge, to the canal bridge, and to support, not to relieve, but to support, and then also to go on into La Porte, and then further on into Benneville, and to deal with any enemy there.
I mean, it's such a shining example of how it all should have worked, and that's obviously the narrative of what many people are familiar with when they're at they're thinking of that night with the gliders and things coming in. But there's another 89 gliders scheduled to come in. I mean, the first thing the rest of them will be is Flak over France. That must be the first horrific thing the gliders, and I guess and the main body of paratroopers coming in, which have to face.
Yeah,
which must have been horrific.
Yeah, there was. I said before about the problem with the wind changing. There are accounts from glider pilots, and indeed from tug crews as well, of coming under fire from anti-aircraft units. They realised that they were actually receiving that fire from Le Havre. So they had been, pushed way off track. So they sort of had to, navigate their way back in, but they were picking up there. But yeah, you're right. There were anti-aircraft units, on the ground in the Caen area as well, which was obviously the major city there. In the landing area, they were receiving flak, and some aircraft were hit. There were obviously troops on the ground as well, so they were particularly troubled by snipers on LZN when they were clearing the poles. But there were isolated units there. What's interesting though about the opposition is that, and let's just deal with the Panzers straight away, right? Because most people listening to this will know that the whole thing about Hitler, not letting the Panzers go, and the Fuhrer had taken a sleeping pill and couldn't be woken up, so they're all the commanders there, they want to go, but they can't. But Ranville was defended, was garrisoned, but on that particular night, most of the garrison was away out of the village on exercises. And it was, the same with, again, listeners will be aware of the fact that a lot of the German commanders for Normandy were over Rouen way, I think they were, weren't they? On or Rennes and somewhere on anti-invasion. They were playing war games, for a possible invasion in Normandy. So it was, I don't know, luck, yeah, maybe. There wasn't that kind of opposition. So, Ranville was the first village to be liberated. And liberated, not without loss, but it was liberated, fairly quickly. And then obviously held as well.
What amazed me about, all right, they're scattered all over. I mean, that's one thing. You're not landing necessarily where you wanting to be. But what comes reading through the reminiscences time after time is how destructive the heavy landings would be. But that's not just in necessarily men. It's in material. It's the fact that you can't get equipment off the gliders. Why was there such a high casualty rate? They had practice for this. If I say casualty, I mean not just in people in Why that? What had gone wrong there for these? When they came down to make such, if you call them heavy landings.
We've talked about the bridges and what happened with the gliders there. The coup de main on the battery, that didn't happen for various reasons. One of the gliders didn't even make it out of the UK, and the other two didn't get to where they were supposed to be. The equipment carrying gliders coming into N in the dark, with or without landing aids. If with landing aids, then incorrectly placed landing aids. They were then fighting with natural enemies, if you like, with trees. They were battling with man-made, like walls. So these plywood aircraft, some of them did suffer because they, crashed off trees, or they crashed off walls, and they bumped and bounced around. And you're absolutely right that, they were twisted up so much that it was difficult to get some of the equipment out. But for the majority of them landing on Tonga, the gliders, they made it to the landing zone, and they made it in one piece. And the men and materiel on board got off and went to do what they were tasked to do.
Or attempted to get to the rendezvous. I was saying, if you look at...
Or attempted to get to the... Well, absolutely. Yeah.
If we look at what they achieved, I mean, the achievement of taking the gun battery is staggering, considering how many were... Well, do you want to talk us through taking the gun battery? Because that,
Well, with gun battery, yeah. I mean, we're coming back to the fact, that the men were scattered to the four winds. And Terry Otway ended up with, a minimum force. And yet, such is the spirit of the parachute regiment, that they just went and took it in anyway, That's what we're here to do.
Yeah, I think I have a note that he was meant to have 750 and he attacked with 150. He gave up waiting, which was just incredible.
We can't wait any longer, lads, let's go.
And then they suffered almost exactly 50% casualties.
So, with minimum force, and they still suffered huge casualties, but they took the battery. They succeeded. It is that kind of grit and spirit that you see throughout that operation, both from the men that came in under silk and those that came inside a plywood tube.
Plywood tube.
Their spirit and their grit, and it's down to I know the Americans talk a lot about citizen soldiers, but the citizen soldiers, these young men, they were true professionals. They had trained long and hard to do a particular job, and by God, they were going to do that job. And nothing and nobody was going to stop them doing it. And this is where I was saying before about the training that they had, where they had their own jobs to do, but they also knew other people's jobs as well.
I think they did. Did they achieve all their objectives on the night?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, everything was done. I suppose I've talked about the gliders, but if I can for a minute, just talk about the men that actually sat, at the front end. The glider pilot regiment was made up of volunteers from many branches, corps, regiments of the British Army. It was the smallest and the shortest lived of British regiments. 1942 to 1957. Something over 3,000 men altogether trained. They were obviously, the men that flew the gliders in on Tonga. Quite a few of them, particularly as far as this anti-tank gun wall of armour, if you like, the guns. Quite a few of the guys were involved in that. Where they could, they had put the pilots were ex-Royal Artillery with the guns in the back. However, glider pilots were described by George Chatterton as total soldiers, because they were well and truly special forces men. And they were trained to fly, and they were trained to fight. They were trained on all manner of British weapons, Allied weapons, but on German weapons as well. And they could fire anything, they could drive anything. I guess, given the chance, they could fly pretty much anything. So they really were special forces, trained to the nth degree. Their orders on operation were to get back to their lines, as quickly as they could. So on this operation, it was, back to the beaches, lads, and then get away. Didn't happen for all of them. There were pilots who were killed, and we've said before about the landings, and there were those that were killed when they landed. Some were killed when the gliders came down in the channel. They didn't make it. One of whom was my uncle and his co-pilot. But those that that did make it and made it in safe and sound, they went and they did what they had to do. Yeah, a lot of them got to the rendezvous where they were, and then they got back to the beaches, but they were still, quite a lot of them were involved in little fights, little skirmishes and whatever.
Well, considering their fate when they're injured and these things come down, there are a lot of them said to be catapulted through the front with their seat and everything through the perspex windows and things. Considering the risks that they went through, I was staggered that so many of them went on to fly at Arnhem and Varsity, the crossing of the Rhine, and 24 that had landed at Tonga would die at Arnhem and Varsity, which is sad, but it shows the mettle of the men to go through it all again, because I'm not sure. I think I might have been tempted to throw the towel in.
Yeah, no, they really were, as I said, special forces, and they. I suppose that, when you're looking at the training that, at the time, a man had to go through to join the parachute regiment. These men for the glider pilot regiment were the best of the best. And there were all sorts of things that were used to weed out those that just didn't meet, the grade or if you like, didn't have that metal. So those that did get to wear the Army flying badge, the line with blue wings, or later the second pilot's brevet, they had proved that they were the best, and they could do this job. And so, yeah, as you say, they flew to Normandy and they flew to Holland and they flew to Germany.
What I did find curious is it Mallard that comes in later on the 6th, but comes in the evening on the 6th where it's still light. Of 256 gliders, 246 landed safely, which seems, and more or less in the right position, which seems a complete difference from those that had landed overnight. It was that purely down to day and night? Because that suddenly looks like a really exciting figure to be working rather well as an operation.
And just that, they were flying in daylight into landing zones that were secured.
So ultimately, can we say Tonga was a success, or was it a costly failure, or a complete success, or somewhere between?
In as much as an operation is considered a success, if all its objectives are achieved, then it was a success. It was certainly perhaps I was going to say the most. I was going to say the most riskiest, but it wasn't. There were huge risks. The fact that they were landing at night, and in enemy territory and whatever. But yeah, they did it. They did it.
I wondered, I couldn't see it as being necessarily a failure, costly perhaps, but I wondered if they'd learnt, say, and this is something they continue to learn, that the problem with the Airborne is that it doesn't always land where you put it. So, there's this idea that each Airborne operation seems to be bigger than the last, and that could perhaps be to factor in the fact that large numbers of people might not get to where they need to be when they need to get them to be. So, when you attack your battery with 150 men, they can do it, but you have to put a lot of extra in, factoring in that they're not going to turn up.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily agree with the subsequent operations, being larger to ensure success. Arnhem is an entirely different series of podcasts, The fact that they didn't put down more men more quickly was an error that compounded in so many ways, and that the Germans actually picked up and put into their planning when they were preparing to receive the Allies into Germany in 1945.
It was because it is just struck you, because by the time you get to Varsity, it's an enormous operation. Varsity
is still the largest single lift airborne operation in history. That was daylight landing right on top of the enemy, heavily fortified area, all objectives secured within 2 to 3 hours.
So, do you want to tell us about what's this film you're involved with?
Yes, thank you. The film that I'm involved with as a scriptwriter and producer is called True Valor. It is the story of the experiences of the 13th Parachute Battalion. I've mentioned some of their exploits in Normandy. But we picked the battalion up in pre-D-Day training, and in particular focusing on the platoon led by Lieutenant Ellis Dixie Dean, who actually saw service right through and was on varsity as well. At the time, he was in command of the mortar platoon, but as part of that, they did some work with the Vickers machine gun as well. And Brigadier Poet, who was 5th Parachute Brigade commanding officer, was so impressed with the way that Dean commanded the guns on an exercise that he actually ordered Lieutenant Colonel Peter Luard, the 13th CO, to have Dean's platoon retrained on the Vickers. So we picked that up in the story as they retrain and they are prepared for Normandy. Significantly, the platoon didn't actually fly to Normandy with the 13th. They actually went with the 12th Parachute Battalion because their role was to be part of the defence force for the anti-tank guns that were coming in by glider. So we fly with them into Normandy. We are there with them on D-Day, but we're there with the battalion as well. So we're there with the engineers and those Poles. We're there in Vaughanville. We're there when the Panzers are released, von Luck's troops. And then we stay with them as they move around Normandy over the next 13 weeks. I know it's spooky, isn't it? But the 13th Parachute Battalion left Lark Hill Camp and returned there 13 weeks later, or pretty much, you know. It's just one of those things. So we sort of follow them through Normandy until their last major battle, and that's where we leave them.
How far along with you? Have you started turning over the camera yet?
Oh no. We're nowhere near what we call principal photography. No. We're nowhere near that yet. Where we are at the moment is that we are in development, and we are hoping very soon to start picking up the funding that we need to move us towards finalising cast and crew, you know, and getting to the stage where, as you say, we can start, you know, turning over the camera. Yeah. Thanks, you know, Angus, for giving me the chance to plug this. So I suppose really I ought to say that you can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. We've got a website as well. The name of the film is True Valor.
You can find the film on Facebook, and that's True Valor Movie. And the website is truevalormovie.com. I'll put links to that and to Stephen's book, Operation Tonga, on the website. So thank you, Stephen. Next time, we'll be looking at the psychological effect of the German Airborne on Britain at the start of the war. That was going to be this episode, but for some reason I now can't remember. I swapped them around. If you want to join the conversation, don't forget you can find me on Facebook, WW2 Podcast, and you can become a patron at patreon.com/WW2 Podcast. Thanks for listening.